course. But, you know, the coal is the future and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, that's another question. But what's there, you know, and what is the what are the if the big bastions of the manual working class are closing down or have been closed down, the big engineering plants and the mines in car factories and so on, what has replaced them? What are the typical forms of employment? And the point that I wanted to make here, it's not a very original point, I mean, I'm not claiming originality for anything that I say here, incidentally, this point been made by people on the far left repeatedly, is that the typical forms of employment are things like warehouses, like call centres, like distribution centres, at one end, of course, and light industry. I mean, it's not true that Britain has been completely deindustrialised and so on, and retailing, but also at the other end, financial services. And a host of smaller kind of professional employment. But even if you look at financial services, the number of people who are top bankers in financial services earning millions and all that sort of thing, even in the city, where they're talking about, I don't know, people are estimating maybe 30,000, 40,000 people have been made unemployed in the city already. The vast majority, of course some of those will be traders and bankers and so on, the vast majority will be fairly ordinary, low-grade people, including secretaries, clerical workers and so on. Even in banking, the vast majority of employees in banking have pretty humdrum jobs and not making fast deals and are making not a very big amount of money. But on this thing about affluence, and because this guy Joaquin Bastello says, well, you know, look at what people have now compared with the 50s, all the electronic goods, and or you know, holidays abroad and all this kind of thing. It's well, you know, what is regarded as a kind of viable standard of living is historically determined by the growth of the productive forces. But the question of you know, the relative wealth and share of income of the working class, you can't have what is the historically determined average level of income for the working class now without having two incomes. I mean, in the 1950s, you didn't have the vast array of iPods and all those kind of things, okay, and the internet and widescreen televisions and holidays in Spain, all that was just starting. But you could have a single man, or people who were called in the 1950s bachelors, who had an averagely good, you know, manual working class job, who could buy a house on his own and have hobbies and a shed and pigeons and things like that. So, but today that's impossible. It's almost impossible for a single person to buy a house today, or to do all those other things. And so people struggle to maintain affluence and to maintain like that. But it almost invariably involves both parents working. It almost invariably involves longer hours, more flexible working than existed in the 50s and 60s, Sunday working and all that kind. What it means, all those things which, you know, thing, it involves, of course, everything that comrades know about greater insecurity and all that kind of what they regard as affluence and basic conditions for their kids and so on, all that kind of thing. It's interesting though that all the surveys that have been done, not very many, but all of them show that the number of people who regard themselves as working class is huge. You know, they may be able to afford 80 quid each to go to a Phil Collins concert, but Phil Collins still gives, George Michael, no, he doesn't do it either. I don't know any of the new ones, but from the 1980s, people like that. But they still regard themselves as working class, even if, you know, it's obvious. And so this survey that was reported by the BBC, by this think tank, that showed 67% of all people asked regarded themselves as working class, which the people who did the survey say is phenomenal, extraordinary, especially in view of the kind of barrage of propaganda. You know, that we're all middle class now, and the old class divisions don't exist, and so on and so forth. I think, though, one aspect that we have to look at, and often I think people on the left are very loath to look at it and to recognise the full dimensions of it, and that is the cultural changes as a result of relative working class retreat since the 1980s. And the cultural changes, I think, you know, sometimes summed up as dumbing down, sometimes summed up as celebrity culture. The obsession with celebrity, which didn't quite, you know, there've always been stars, there's always been the Hollywood star system, but this mania for celebrity, this obsession, you know, with obsession, a society which is obsessed with people who are famous for being famous. And that's deep inside the youth. And there's the young people today, I tell you, they're absolutely, of course they always were to a certain extent, dominated by hedonistic ideas. The key thing to do is have a good time. That's what all young people want to do. And there's nothing wrong with having a good time. Although sometimes I think, you know, that we should, you know, it should be allowed by the Central Committee once or twice a year. I think the rich and famous, another way of being obsessed with the rich and famous, that, you know, for example, the left is very reluctant to look drug culture squarely in the eyes. I mean, drug culture is universal amongst young people. The drugs of choice are centrally connected with taking drugs that you have when you have sex at the same time. This dimension of it people don't like to discuss. It's very difficult to say, you know, this is like militant. Taking drugs is because you know, people are desperate and they're unemployed and they're downtrodden and so on. People take drugs because they want to have a good time. And however, the whole collection of things, this hedonistic culture and celebrity culture, it's caused massive, absolutely massive depoliticisation in the youth. And there is a massive crisis in the trade unions. Look at the TUC on the telly. How many young people did you see get up and making speeches? Now, what is the average age of a unison steward?
47 plus.
47 plus. And you know, this problem of renewal is very important. The other aspect of it that the article tries to take up, but I had to write this very quickly in the morning to replace an article that wasn't being written. I should have made more of this, but it's been done a lot better by lots of people, and that's the recomposition, the global recomposition of the working class, because nothing looks more stupid now than Andrei Gortz and all those people in the mid-1980s who wrote books saying goodbye to the working class. On a world scale, it's a big hello to the working class, a massive hello to the working class. Probably the working class in China today is bigger than the working class in the whole of Europe, Western Europe was in the 1980s. And this is the big story of the last 20 years of the 20th century, the proletarianisation of vast sections of the peasantry. People, it's like the enclosure movement in Britain and Scotland in the late Middle Ages, the early modern period. And, I mean, Paul Mason puts it like this in his book, which is a strangely titled book, actually. It's Live Working or Die Fighting. Bad choice, probably live working is the better option. But he says, probably the future of the struggle for socialism is going to be determined in the next 20 years by what happens in China. Now, that may be an exaggeration. Nonetheless, I think there's an important element of truth. It will just be unmaterialist to say that a decreasing part of what we used to call the advanced capitalist countries. Huge new working class, but it still all depends. The outcome ultimately depends on what happens in Britain, the United States, and so on. And a working class is, I think, the problem again is the one of political representation, because there are huge working class struggles that occur on a daily basis in China, and there are even academics who talk about the emergence of a new underground Chinese left, and they say, not unnaturally, a lot of the kind of things are going on, but they're not very open, and they're not very, people have big illusions in Mao and the Mao period and all that. Those are strong, and in general the formation of left organisations in Asia inside this new working class is quite a weak process. The Western Europe, Japan and the United States. There's but as the idea that there's no working class consciousness of a class for, ultimately a class for itself in a complete sense has to be a revolutionary class. It means that it's conscious of itself, and in that sense there's no class for itself. Well, that's just obviously true, but that's true always outside of a revolutionary period. That's the problem of political representation. And sometimes the left has mechanical views of this. First of all, you get the development of struggle, and then you get the development of political consciousness. But all the recent evidence, I think, is that the emergence of political formations which represent the working class in the political arena can actually be a spur to struggles and intersect with new struggles. I think in the 80s that was the case in Brazil, and in the 90s that was the case in Italy to a certain extent. Another dimension which is almost completely absent from the article, which I'd put in much more prominently if I rewrote it today, is what's happening in Latin America. Because the idea that there's no consciousness in the Latin American working class and popular movements of the working class, or the working class, the peasantry and the urban poor. The formulations by organisations of the Latin American left are very sophisticated. They don't just talk about the working class, they talk about, the typical slogan is gobierno, obrero, campesino, indígena y popular. Workers, peasants, indigenous and popular is everybody else's press that we haven't thought of, goes into that category. But the working class is still in that concept, and obviously the working class is central in Bolivia and in Venezuela. The other aspect, which is very weak in the document, in the article, is what we've discussed a lot. What is the ideological antidote to consumerism and crass celebrity culture and the cult of luxury and all that kind of stuff? And what we have discussed over the last 2 years, that the ideological thing which is most damaging to that and can have most appeal amongst the youth is the environmental struggle. Because all of this swivelling of production towards luxury production under neoliberalism is immensely damaging to the environment and immensely wasteful. And the environmental movement provides the outlines of a conception of a different way of organising everyday life. And again, in my view, the left has been, I'm not saying we haven't said anything about it, but we've been quite weak on that question. So, has working class consciousness declined? Yes. Has it, especially in Britain, United States? It's a long thing, and to a certain extent in some European countries as well, and certainly in Japan since the 40s and 50s. Has it completely collapsed? That's an obvious exaggeration. There's the massive potential for the development of class consciousness and class struggle in the new working class globally, even if that is as yet in its embryonic phase.
Okay, right, thanks a lot, Phil. So just open up for questions, contributions.